Good afternoon, everybody. It is Friday, the 10th of September. You're here at Lunch and Learn. We are in the process of unmuting folks, and then we don't have any particular items on the agenda today. Again, no one has sent any questions or made requests for a certain topic. So we're kind of wide open to talk about whatever. So if you have questions about difficult cases or specific protocols, software, and other things that have come up on the listserv. So we'll see if anybody has anything. Otherwise, I'm sure one of us will bring up something.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, this is Bobby, and I was wondering if you could say a little about the cingulate, because when the maps just spit out the descriptions of what's going on where, I don't think I ever see them talk about FZ, CZ, or PZ.
Good question. Why doesn't FZ or CZ or PZ show up in the protocols? Are you talking about?
Yeah, like in the protocols or in the, I guess.
On the map itself.
Well, they show up on the map because I have the 19 channel.
Yeah, on the 19 channel, but they don't show up on the mini Q, I don't think, but they show up on the 19 channel. That is correct. The mini Q maps are a special case, and we started out with those for clinicians who were just we had a simpler technology, and a lot of people couldn't afford the brain mapping equipment. So we had a simpler technology where you could collect 12 locations, but we didn't post CZ. It was a different paradigm in those days. We had a different approach, so we didn't use it. But for the 19 channel maps, or even if you have a 4-channel amplifier and you get 19 channels out of it, or you have a 19 channel amplifier and you get 19 channel, either way, you'll have the midline. So that's true. Now the midline doesn't show up on the protocols, and it's not likely to show up on the final report either. That's for sure. Is that kind of the question you were getting at?
Yeah, and so I'm kind of wondering what would be addressed at each of those locations compared to, like, say, the 3 and 4 on either side of them.
Fantastic. The midline is where we trained for from about 1989 until about 2000, when people started getting into QEEG. Everybody used the midline because we only had single channel amplifiers, and some people had 2. Now, to be fair, Thought Technology came out with a 2-channel amplifier in, I think it was 1999, around there. And even then, the only people who picked that up and really started using it was Val Brown and NeuroCare Pro. That's when I had conversations with Val Brown about 2-channel training. We had a lot of agreements, a couple of disagreements, and that's part of the reasons why you don't see the midline. But everybody was training on the midline mostly with those single channel amplifiers. Now, the Othmers were training C3 for 15 minutes and then C4 for 15 minutes, and they would go back and forth from those locations only. And Val Brown was only training at C3 and C4, but he would do both at the same time instead of going back and forth. And of course, the Othmers, Siegfried said, that really is probably a better way to control everything, but everything was so settled, they were just beginning to turn that around when they decided to go to infralow. But after that conversation with him, that influenced me greatly. And so he recommended, he said, you should go for that. And I said, I am. So Rob and I showed up at the same time, and Rob and I started working at 2-channel because Rob had a limited amount of time and he didn't have time to train one side and then the other. So the research looked good, and he was in a lab, and we had all these professionals at this big organization there at Old Vineyard Behavioral Health. And so we both started working, with the 2 channels, and Rob was using them there and I was using them in my office, and we were comparing 2-channel bipolar with regular 2-channel, and that's why we ended up going from bipolar to 2-channel, because of what Rob learned in the lab there, but also I've seen the same thing in my office. And so that's why we tend to train at that time, we didn't have the research from the MRI community telling us that oh, by the way, most of the networks are homotopic, C3, C4, F3, F4, you know, P3, P4. So once we saw that, we were like, wow, we really are onto the right thing here. And then we saw the research coming from Harvard about callosal inhibitory mechanisms, and we thought, wow, well, that even, so we just kept seeing more and more research which was supporting our clinical observations. So that's why all of the protocols are that way in the NewMind map, because that's the most dynamic and powerful way to train based on all the research we've seen, plus our laboratory work, plus our clinical work. So there's a lot of thought, a lot of time, and a lot of effort went into that. Rob, do you have anything to add to that about the 2-channel?
The only thing I would add is one of the reasons I had asked Richard about going to a 2-channel model. First off, the other thing too is that it was at that time, it was 2008 or 2007 actually, that Brainmaster first released its 4-channel amp. So there weren't even 4-channel amps available until then.
Yes.
But I remember talking to you about the fact when I trained on the left side, these kids felt really focused and very sharp. So when I sent them back to school, they were really doing quite nicely because we're activating the left hemisphere quite nicely. The ones that when I trained them on the right, it was like they were going to go back and take a nap. And I remember having a couple of kids that I just felt they hadn't been sleeping well. They really needed to be able to rest after the session, and sending them back to the unit. And staff would say, so-and-so, as I said, you tell the therapist I said they take a nap. I'm clinical director. You don't have a choice. He's taking a nap. And notice that. So that's when I said to Richard, I said, if we did both, I could send them either back to the unit to rest or back to school. But one side, sometimes just one side or the other.
Yes.
I'm getting a few complaints from the teachers. They're coming to
Right.
class and they're really happy, but they're not doing anything.
Well,
so yeah.
Well, the other thing that I had found, which why I was in favor, was that if, let's say, you have somebody who has not enough activation on the left side, well, if you up train the beta and down train alpha or theta or delta, what happens is that the beta on the right side goes up and the theta, alpha, or beta goes down. So you activate somebody, yes, on the left side, but you also enhance their adrenal output and cortisol and everything. So that, and the norepinephrine increases. So now, if they have any mood issues that are just starting to settle in, they'll become irritable and start fighting with the other kids in class. And if they're already in anxiety, it'll ramp up their anxiety. So now they'll shut down in class. They'll be more anxious, and they'll carry that home. So, and we saw that consistently. I mean, we were tracking it. I was running 5 clinics before I got in there. I was tracking that back in the early 2000s through 5 clinics, doing like 60 to 90 hours a week all around the United States. And I can tell you, it was no fun managing 5 clinics. I hadn't time for anything but management. And I like working with people. I'm not into management. So that was, so when Rob went into it, I was like, yeah, this is the way to go, because of the other senior people in the field who are going that way. That's basically what Val was doing, and he was getting great results. Sigfrid thought that's the way we should go. I started doing it, getting good results. And when I didn't do it, I could literally see on the trend screens and the reports from the parents and the teachers later what had happened for each session. So it all became pretty obvious. And then we saw the research coming out, particularly by Menon and Laird. I mean, that showed us that that all the research was showing that the networks are two-sided. Now, juxtaposed to that was that whole tradition for 20 years where we were training at CZ. People didn't want to train in front of CZ because there was too much artifact, and that defied the rules of operant conditioning. And they didn't have live auto artifacting then. That was just a dream. And they would train at PZ or OC for alpha theta. A lot of times they would train alpha at PZ for calming, or P4 for calming. So there was this whole set of protocols you could do for single channel. Now, so the cingulate would be running down from FZ to CZ to PZ, to, and it stops there. And it's just getting into PZ is where the cingulate discontinues, and then you get into other structures of the brain. FZ forward, same thing. When you start getting in forward of FZ, you're getting into the executive region. Just between CZ and FZ is the main output for the whole basal ganglia, which most people don't know, but if you read your neuroanatomy, they've known that for 50 years, I think, something like that. So we found that also with a lot of people, you could still train, you know, because they didn't produce that much artifact at FZ, but not everybody. But a lot of the kids and adults, you could train at FZ to help with the anterior cingulate, which helped a lot with attention. In fact, we found that training at FZ tended for a lot of people to be better for attention than CZ, not always. So that brings up the point, and I'm going to keep making this point, that neurofeedback is no different than functional medicine, in that there is no one protocol that works for one label. Everybody's different. And you could have a thyroid problem, but it could be from flying on planes too much and radiation. It could be from lead and mercury toxins, or it could be from lipopolysaccharides leaking out of your inflamed gut. All of these things. So there's not going to be one way to treat somebody with a thyroid or Hashimoto's. And the same goes for attentional problems. There's not one place to train that's always going to get it. And I know people want that, but you can never have that, and you never will, because it's just not possible. I mean, it's like asking the sun to rise in the west. So please bear in mind that you have to move around regardless of what protocols you're getting, and you do have to try different locations. But we've given you, hopefully, guidance for how to do that. And I'm always happy to go over it on the Lunch and Learn again and again. But when you're training CZ, that would be for motor tics and any motor related handwriting problems, fine motor skills. CZ is usually the place for that. FC tends to be a superior place to enhance attention. But if the person has anxiety, it's not going to do it. So you see, let's say the attention problem is from anxiety, and since there's only 4% of people with supposedly something called ADHD, and there's 30% of your kids are going to have anxiety, which do you think is most likely what you're dealing with? So if you're going to gamble, and we all gamble, you have to. Life is about probabilities. You get out of bed in the morning, that's your first move in a game of gambling. You're gambling that you're going to get up and not fall down, but one day you will. And we'll take you to the hospital with a broken hip and it may be over. So you don't know. But I will lay my odds on the 30% more than the 4%, regardless of whatever else any doctor or anybody else is saying, because they don't have a brain map. And most of them don't even know this. In fact, it's amazing how many counselors don't know this. So my odds say, if they're having an attentional problem, go for FC if you're only doing midline. Go for that second. If you're going for a kid with attention deficit, supposedly, training at C3, C4 is really good because you can activate the left side and calm the right, and you're doing SMR on the right, which will help with their sleep. And a major portion of the kids with attention deficit have a sleep disorder. In fact, that's the most common reason, because it's more common to have a sleep disorder than to have attention deficit or anxiety. And then, so you have to look at the probabilities. What's most common is most likely the place you want to start training. So midline, I would start in the center regions, C3, C4, or even CZ, and try to calm them down. If it looks mostly like it's theta and they don't have that much anxiety or depression, FZ. You could even go FZ if they have depression and they're not paying attention, because training FZ up will activate the frontal area and the brain will tend to shift to the right symmetry. At the same time, PZ is a really good place for anxiety. You can train alpha up and whatever else you've got down, usually beta, and that'll calm them down. So the midline is an older way to do it, and granted it's simpler, but it just tends not to usually be as effective as C3, C4, F3, F4, or P3, P4.
Yeah, I've trained combining, training at FZ and CZ, which is nice because it can help with that focus and attention, yet the whole calming aspect of training SMR at CZ. And then I wondered, if you have a lot of anxiety, why not just train low beta up at FZ versus beta?
Can you say that again? Why what?
I've done a lot of training beta up at FZ and then SMR up at CZ together simultaneously, which is a nice protocol, helps with the focus, the attention,
Yeah.
and with calming and all that. But if they had a lot of anxiety, I would wonder, why not just train the low beta up at FZ versus beta? If the map is showing a lot of beta, would it not make sense just to do SMR?
Well,
Or I mean, not SMR, but low beta.
That could work, particularly if they have beta spindles, but then it might not. In which case,
Right.
you'd have to go to the back of the brain and maybe train alpha up, or go to C4 and train alpha, or P4, train alpha up and something down. Usually I find with the kids under 12, training SMR tends to work better at calming kids, and that adults, I mean, have you found that? And then adults tend to do better with the alpha asymmetry stuff?
Well, I tend to start almost everybody off, much like you. Instead of doing a C3, C4 protocol, I almost start everybody off with SMR at CZ, just as a general calming, and it gives me a good sense of how they're going to respond. So I like starting there, and it's safe. If I didn't have a map, I'd feel comfortable doing that as well in those cases. But I agree. Yeah, once just to get the brain calmed down and get them used to the process, and then I start targeting the areas that I think are going to be most useful.
Yeah,
I do the same thing. I do that as well. I think of everyone as needing some help with sleep anyway.
Yeah.
The minimum I'm actually starting with is 6 sessions of SMR. I don't always do 12 to 15. Sometimes I'll bring it lower, 10 to 13. But if I see more inflammation, I'll even move from 6 sessions to up to 12 sessions before I move into anything else.
Yeah.
That's been very successful, both kids and adults, both.
When I was working at the residential center, I would meet with the therapist, when I was there during the lunch hour, and go over the cases I was working with. So whenever she came in, and I'd sit down and say, well, how's so-and-so doing? Whenever she said, I just want to kill him, and that told me that she was having a lot of behavioral problems. The kid was acting out against peers and staff, and just a real management case. And that was always her comment. And I always went to C3, C4. Then I found those 2 sites, based on the map, if there's a protocol, or looking at the map and creating a protocol. Training at C3, C4 with kids in particular was just really great for just generalized calming and behavioral, calming.
Funny that you say that. 2 days ago, the mother says, well, he's sleeping so much better, but can you do something about this aggression? So I thought, well, we were going to start with frontals, but now we're going to start with centrals. So that's what we moved to, C3, 4. Same thing.
Everybody's different, right? And you've got to run a couple of sessions to get a feel for them, right?
Yeah.
What works for them. Now you can take the two channel protocols will always usually be safe and work well, and that's why they're there. It's a place to start from, particularly if you're new in the field. That's why we put them in there. But we never intended for them to be like some kind of rigid rule that you had to follow all the time. Our assumption always was this is where people start, and as they gain skill, they can innovate and move around more. And, you know, you come to the lunch and learns to hear how senior people in the field innovate and move around. So that's what the lunch and learn's for. So I think that's a really good way to go. You know, going to workshops, you know, can be overwhelming and you get so much diverse information. You don't know how good it is. You know, here you're hearing seasoned people in the field, been at this for a long time or running really big clinics, and how we've watched the field evolve and how we've decided to innovate and what research we're using. So it reduces the mythology and the misleading statements, and people who've only been doing it 2 or 3 years who decided that they know everything, and there's a lot of that out there. Be careful of it.
You know, I did a remap yesterday of a 12-year-old who had all those not focusing, not paying attention, driving everybody crazy kind of, and he had a lot of inflammation. And he's got the kind of body, if you know football, there's a wide receiver kind of look to a body or a tight end look. And he had that, and he'd been playing football and he'd been doing, and we had this whole conversation, which I really only learned to have that kind of conversation from being here about what's going to happen down the road if he continues playing all these sports where he keeps getting his head hit. And so we did 2 rounds in the front, F3-4 and F7-8, and I remapped him yesterday. And I'm like, I wanted to jump up and down. It sometimes when neurofeedback does a great job, it almost moves me to tears, I'll be honest. It's just, I find it quite overwhelming the way this helps people. And this boy, he changed. He's only playing basketball. That's the only thing, because he really understood it, because he saw it and then he understood it. And the change was 59% change on his map.
Wow.
Because he made other changes as well. And, you know, they did some dietary stuff and, you know, and they took it seriously, comprehensively seriously, you know, and it is kind of amazing. And I'm happy that to listen to the evolution, the way when you all talk about having done this for so many years, the way things have evolved makes, you know, I feel like I'm standing on shoulders and not you know what I mean? I'm standing on this base of knowledge and I'm not winging it, because winging it is this, it's the brain. I don't want to wing it with the brain. I want to like go with, okay, well, I'll modify a little bit, but I want to stay in the science, you know?
Yeah, good for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so true. Good way to go. Now, a lot of times people, you know, you don't always need to start at CZ SMR up. If you have somebody who looks sensitive, you know, people who have filtering problems, and they talk about the rain storms really affecting them, or electrical things affecting them, definitely that start them off at CZ. And there's no reason you couldn't start everybody off at CZ. There's quite a few people who do that, CZ SMR up for a few sessions. I have over the years been saying to people, whatever the protocol shows up on the output, start training at CZ with that protocol for 4 or 5 sessions, just to get a sense of what their brain does. And when you're training at CZ, that's the place where you're going to have the least negative side effects and impact. It's the oldest area of the brain. It seems to be more resilient. And it's, so if you train at C3, C4 with that first protocol, and it says train in protocol number 2 at T3, T4, I would go to C3, C4 and start there for a few sessions and get a sense of how that protocol is affecting their brain and how comfortable they are with the minimal side effects. And then, okay, then go to T3, T4 with it, or P3, P4. It's kind of like knocking at the door of the brain and saying, oh, hello, you know, can I come in and show you this new thing?
Do you feel the same way if it's an asymmetry protocol that's been suggested under the protocols?
Yep, absolutely.
Test that at C3-4?
Mm-hmm. We've done that at our clinic for 20 years.
And so how many sessions would you do before you would go to the, like, say, the 0102 location as recommended, if you were trying it out?
Oh, I would do, you know, like 3 or 4, just to make sure that there were no strong side effects and that I've notified the brain and that we were doing that. And then usually when you move to the new location, you don't get those strong side effects because you're pushing the brain too hard. You're not overtraining the brain. That concept of overtraining the brain is a myth based on the fact that somehow you have the power to take this incredibly complex 3 million year old biocomputer and just give it some feedback and you're going to force it to change. If our brain was that open to change, if it was that vulnerable, we would have never gotten past the first year of life as a species. So the brain won't let you change it unless it's ready to go. And sometimes the brain's ready to go, but emotionally you're not ready to go with it. So in that sense, usually when people have side effects, it's usually because they're emotionally unprepared for what starts coming up. And T3, T4 happens to be a really powerful location in P3, P4 because they have direct input to the insula and the amygdala. And so when you start training those areas, that really push things. Plus, they're major convergence zones. P3, P4, and T3, T4 are the two biggest convergence zones where everything comes together in the brain. Besides FP1, FP2. You'll find a lot of times you train at F7, F8, not a lot happens because it's not a major convergence zone. It's really where the incident fasciculus is, But if you're getting around T3, T4, you're getting right into the insula. And I'm sure a lot of you are watching the research on the insula. Every decade, we find out how much more important this thing is. And it's the insula that has the direct input to the vagal pathways to your gut, too. So, in terms of mind-body interface, T3, T4 is the spot. In terms of brain integration, getting the front and the back and everything, FP1, FP2 is where it all ends. So if you think about it that way, that can sometimes help guide your ideas. Anybody else have things they do for the first couple of sessions? I mean, see, just because we've laid those down doesn't mean it's the only thing to do or it's the only thing that works. Other clinicians come up with other things that work really well with their populations, but it's after some practice and a little bit of experimenting, but gentle experimenting. Does anybody else have a favorite place to start or method?
Well, I like starting typically at CZ or C3, C4, again, for the purposes we've just discussed. And then I go into my biases. So I always, when I mentor people, I tell them, when I give you basic information, if most of it's going to be based in the literature, the science, the field, then, I may have an opinion about something, but opinions are a dime a dozen. So it doesn't mean it's the way, it's a way, it's an opinion. And then I tell them I have my biases, and we've discussed that here quite a bit. So, my biases are depending on what their chief presentation problems are. If we have poor sleep, we have anxiety, I'm more likely to train from T3, T4, C3, C4, back, eyes closed. And if I'm focusing on focus, attention, concentration, cognitive processing, and depression, then I'm working the frontal lobes, eyes open. So those are my biases. But I also agree with you that I've done T3, T4 quite a bit. It's a great place to train, but I've also learned about how sensitive it is. So I don't typically start there. I go elsewhere and let them get used to training, and then I'll test drive at T3, T4. When I do my very first T3, T4 session, I warn the person if something comes that doesn't feel pleasant or doesn't feel right or something emotional comes up, let me know and we'll pause the session and see what's happening. And I check in every 5 to 10 minutes that first session. If they get through the first session without typically any problems, then I feel better about just running the next session. I might check in once midpoint just to see how they're doing, because I've had people who after 5 or 10 minutes of training at T3, T4 have burst into tears.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I try to avoid that whenever I can. But those are my preferences. And I like working back to front. So when I see a map that's got a lot of problems in the back, it's super low stuff, like 0102 or like all blue. or they're all red, across, 2, 3, or 4 bandwidths, then my preference is to go back there and start working with that and help that area improve, because everything processes, as you were noting, from back to front. And so there's no sense working up front if the back is really dysfunctional. My bias again.
Yeah, but you wrote that about all of this in the book, Doing Neurofeedback. I mean, we
Yeah.
published it in the book, Doing Neurofeedback, and the new version is even more detailed. So
Right.
coming out soon.
I see a question mark in front of Brian's name. Brian, you have a question? I know we usually just jump in with it, but is it there for? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it might have been an accident. My apologies. I'm just listening in.
Okay.
I'm also Brian, and I had the question.
Oh, good. Brian Carr?
Yeah.
Oh, hey, Brian. Yeah, what's the question?
Well, I remember vaguely conversations about, and I'm probably going to botch this, but mu being a different frequency or band than say alpha, and how with clients that have the high alpha with eyes open, one of the I think it was you, Dr. Saylor, said one of the things that you screen for is, you put something in their hands and see if them doing that brings the alpha down. And I noticed that, and I was wondering if there's any implications for that in terms of training or protocols.
Yeah, that's a really tough question that everybody's been struggling from day one in neurofeedback when they first encountered it. And it was the medical EEG people who brought that to our attention, in particular, Jay Ginkleman. He was key in explaining to everybody in our field the medical side of EEG when we first had all these questions, and helping us understand stuff that just wasn't in any of our literature that we didn't know that was done by EEG medical technicians. That's how we learned about putting the thing in your hand, because that's what they do to test to see if it's mu. I mean, you can look at the morphology, but that doesn't guarantee that's what it is. You have to put something in their hand and then they squeeze it. That in a medical EEG, or at least in his day, that's how you did it. And you squeeze it and then suddenly you see it drop. Okay. And we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. I've had several kids where their mu is so high that it's like right over the motor strip, CZ or C3, C4, and it's up like in the 20s, in some cases the 30s. Well, if you have that much mu going on and it's that big, I mean, that's affecting the thalamocortical loop. So that's going to disrupt the entire brain, which kind of says that when they aren't doing anything, their whole motor system just goes into idle, So they tend to be kinesthetic learners. I mean, they can't focus. I mean, their whole brain is just ready for action. And I think it's kind of a genetic variation. Some kids tend to go out and look around and forage and explore more than other kids. And that's who these kids are. In fact, people have speculated that the reason that the people moved from Africa to North America and into Asia was because we had a lot of these, what they were calling ADD now. We had a lot of these people with high levels of mu who were just out exploring. That's what they did. That's how they learned. And one school teacher actually put bicycle pedals in the front row and had all the kids who couldn't pay attention come sit in the front row and pedal the bicycles, and their grades went right up while the bicycle pedals while they watched. So Jay and everybody knows it's really tough to train these kids, because when the mu's that high, you can put a sensor almost anywhere and nothing happens. You just get mu. So if all you're getting on feedback is mu, and you can't make it go down, because that's one of those situations where the brain pushed back. It's genetically built in there. It's built in there for a reason, and you're not going to really train mu down that much. You might get it down a little bit, but odds are, if you do, it's because the child's myelinating, and if they've been in there for a year, they might have myelinated enough in a year so that it's going down. And he's like, oh, look what I did. No, the brain myelinated is what happened. So this is a problem also with just using a clinical case study, one observation, to make a decision about all your clients. There's too many factors to do that, and that's why you have to try different things that you've heard from other clinicians. Sometimes when things aren't going as fast as you want, you say, well, let me try this. Well, let me try this. You take notes. So when mu is really high, what a lot of us found out over the years, and it was Jay who recommended this, is give them something to hold in their hand, and then the mu drops down. And now what you want to train is available to train. I mean, because now the signal processing equipment can pick up the other signals instead of just being completely obliterated by mu. It can pick up the other signals and you can feed back on those signals. So generally that's what you do. Now there may be other ways, but that's what I was trained to do and have done for years.
Another tip that is easier than bicycle pedaling and even and less distracting for the other kids than a fidget spinner is have the person just sort of wiggle their toes and see what effect that has.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Although most kids, I don't know, I think they might get bored with it. And then they start tapping their toes loud. Hey, well, he's making noise.
If you have a subtle beat in the background of the classroom or in their headphones with high tech or their bone conduction headphones, there you go.
Yeah, maybe bone conduction headphones, but then suddenly you're what's that kid got that funny stuff on the class? Let's go pick on him. He looks weak and vulnerable. I mean, that's what kids do. They always look for the weakest, scaredest, most vulnerable looking kid and they go after him. It's natural human behavior.
I'm wondering what the cutoff would be in terms of, I'm not seeing 20 or 30, but more around like the 12 range at CZ.
No,
and that's it goes down to like 7 or 8. Is that not significant enough?
No, mu is rarely is down that low in amplitude.
Okay.
Now, whenever you say rarely with human beings, remember there's nothing that couldn't happen almost with the brain. We're always talking in terms of probability. So odds are, 95% of the people with alpha that low, it's not mu. Mu is usually much higher in amplitude and much more, and it won't be a problem with training it either. I mean, now eyes open 12 microvolts it's up there, but it's usually not a problem to train it down when it's at that rate. In fact, you'll probably have better luck if it is mu training it down to that amplitude than when it's up around 20 or 30. That's when it's, by some of the kids I've had like that, it's, back then we didn't know better. We say, okay, we're just going to do this kid for free because we haven't seen this. We'll see what we get. We'll be in there 20, 25 sessions, nothing. I mean, nothing's changing, nothing's moving. And I'm not talking about one case, I'm talking about years of cases. So we just said, okay, and then we put something in their hand and suddenly we started getting success, just like Jay said. So a little bit of Ginkleman Magic. We learned a lot, like training SMR at PZ often brought down frontal alpha in a lot of people who had brain fog. Who would have thought of that? Well, Jay went down and all this medical literature and traced all the pathways and gave us a lecture like nobody could understand, but we're like, okay, we'll train SMR up and alpha down at PZ and the alpha goes down in the front. It's like, well, who would have thought that? Well, that's before we really knew that so much happened in the back before it got to the front. So these things that people in the medical community like Jay have contributed that have been really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is helpful. I have sort of another question a bit related to training at CZ SMR and wondering about just sort of the standard 3-band range. And, for those people who are really sensitive to it, who may experience some level of discomfort from activation or muscle tension, does anybody ever train a smaller or more narrow window of say 2 instead of 3 amplitudes, like instead of 12 to 15, maybe 12 to 14, or or
Yeah.
11 to 13.
There was a lot of that experimentation going on in the late 90s. Everybody was experimenting. They all had different things. I know some people think that they just invented that in the last year or two, but a lot of people have got that T-shirt in the back of their closet in our field. You can do it, and I think one of the reasons that it's not really done much is because it did work for a few people, but not for a large amount. So it tends to fade out in people's mind. So I wouldn't say don't do it. I'd say there might be some people that it really does work for. Again, it goes back to that rule. There's not one thing for for one category of people. There's not just one protocol or even two. There's a lot of things you can do, but you don't want to do all of those things until you have some experience. Now that you're thinking of it, it means that you've probably tried enough stuff and you know enough that it would be worth trying. So you run a session or two, and the people say, well, how do I know it works? Well, you know if it's working because you see the change in the trend screen. Something should be changing. And the thing that should be changing is not necessarily the SMR, because you can train SMR up and it'll go down. And all the other bands will normalize. So you're training SMR up, instead of going up, it's going down, and all the other bands are normalizing. Well, why? Because they're all going down in power and adjusting in distribution, and the SMR is following them down. So you're still training it up, but it's the center of the whole situation. So it moves with the other frequencies. And that just confuses the heck out of everybody. Saying like, well, how can it go down when I'm training it up? First of all, I didn't authorize that. My answer is that, well, you're talking to 3 million years of wisdom you don't have. And then the other thing is that the whole brain changes. So that's why on our system, the filters you see are delta, theta, alpha, and beta, and high beta. Those are the ones are the default filters, because those are the filters that are it's that distribution of those that's telling you what's happening in the map when you go to see next time and what's going on. To just look at the bands that you're training is so misleading. I saw people for years at Brainmaster try, and it makes sense if you're into stats or numbers. Well, let's see if I train alpha, beta up and theta down, does the theta to beta ratio change, and does the theta go down over time? And if it doesn't, I must be wasting my time. And people would see stuff like the theta would go up and down the whole time and not necessarily have a trend down, and these people would get better. And they say, well, neurofeedback must be a placebo effect, because I'm training, and this happens to researchers, I'm training theta down, it's not going down, and they're getting better. Oh, but you forgot to look at delta, alpha, and beta. And they go, oh, does that make a difference? Because they don't think that, oh, when you train one band, all the other bands go down. I just saw an article published, I think, in 2018, and they were hooting and blowing their horn. We just made a new discovery. In neurofeedback, if you train one band down, they all move at the same time. And the whole article is about that. Like, nobody in the world knew that except the whole field of neurofeedback by that point, or should have known. And I had the article, and I just was, my jaw dropped. I was like, you gotta be kidding. But of course, that'll be heralded as a great study because it was in a formal journal, and, you know, all of that stuff. So much for Margaret Ayers and Joe Lubar and all that stuff. Who are they?
When you look at trend screens, sometimes you can see that influence, especially I've noticed it. People tend to have a lot of high beta, and that begins to pull up or push up the beta. And then oftentimes you see the alpha begin to follow it. And if the alpha starts to go up, then the other slow waves will sort of tend to follow it. So that describes exactly what you're describing. You have to just pay attention to your trend screens, and you will see that phenomenon you just discussed.
Well, but we learned from the work of Ruth Lanius why that is. And by working with that at NewMind a lot, is that a lot of people if you're training them and everything's going down, and you see that high beta comes up, that's an abreaction. They're bracing against something they're feeling. A thought or a feeling came up and they don't know it. So their high beta goes up. So what you're going to see at that point is their favorite defense mechanism. And for a lot of people these days, it's busy mind. So that alpha will just suddenly pump up when that high beta comes up because they're compensating. That's how they compensate for, oh no, I don't want to feel this. You know, it was Joseph Ledoux who found out, wow, if the brain starts overproducing one of those frequencies, like beta or alpha or theta, it's usually to shut down input from the amygdala. And what would he know? Well, he wrote the book on the topic and did more of the, pioneered all the research. And this is what kills me in science. You have people in physics saying, oh, you know, consciousness is non-local and all that stuff is being made up, and the people who are saying that are all the people who have no stature in the field. They're just people who are heads of physics departments, and you know, they don't have Nobel Prizes. You look at all the people who have Nobel Prizes, and they're all saying like, oh, consciousness is non-local. There's intelligent design behind this. We don't even know where the math comes from, but we do it. I mean, so it's the same thing in a lot of the fields. You have these people who are policy people and really rigid scientism people, and they create a problem. But you can see it also in the meetings. You have somebody who's done neurofeedback for a year, they'll get up and say, you have to be right on CZ. Now, why aren't people learning? If you're not on CZ, you're not going to train right. That's somebody who has absolutely no understanding of neurophysics, none. But they've been to a workshop and somebody told them, and a couple of times that may have made a difference in their training, and they're thinking that's what made the difference, when it could have been one of 10 or 12 other variables that made the difference that they're not controlling for. Then that's confirmation bias. You find what you're looking for.
You know, going back for a moment when Brian was talking about what range to go in, I'm remembering Rob putting a screen out in which he put a series of bands rewarding at 0. So you could look at 8 to 10, 10 to 12, 12 to 14. And perhaps that's relevant here for what Brian's talking about. If you want to see what's happening in these shorter bands and then make your decision based on what you're impacting there, is that relevant in here in this conversation?
What do you mean by the shorter bands? I'm not sure.
In other words, when Rob brought up a screen one day and he said, well, let's look at what's happening from 8 to 10. Okay, so you're training, or you're training 12 to 15, but you want to see more. So then you can reward everything at 0, and you can watch segments instead of the full band.
Yes, I think that's really useful.
Right. It's monitoring. That's what Judy's talking about. If you want to monitor a certain band, you set it up. So we used to sometimes want to take a look at whether it was low or high alpha driving the alpha. So we would train your alpha, but in your, and you set 2 more bands, 8 to 10, set the threshold to 0. You're not really training it then, you're just monitoring it. And then you set another band at 10 to 12, and then you'll see which is really driving your alpha, the low or the high.
Yeah, that can be really useful, particularly with alpha.
Yeah, yeah.
I just posted an old article that I probably posted before, but it was a Medscape article on Moo, and there was a little paragraph that made a lot more sense as I reread it while I was multitasking here. But that Moo doesn't go away whether your eyes are open or closed. If you want to differentiate it from alpha, you can have the person open their eyes and close their eyes and then monitor what's going on in the EEG. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's another good way to test for it. Yeah.
The other piece about wiggling the person's toes to get rid of alleged Moo, that's probably best done at CZ, because on the homunculus, that's where the feet are.
Yes.
And if you're doing, the other interesting thing is you can play around with for people that kind of need to be convinced that we know what we're doing. If you have a 2-channel hookup and you have them wiggle their left hand, the right mu band should go down and vice versa.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Well, that was in the article, so I'm just passing that on.
Well, that's what we want to do is take what the researchers doing it and apply it, because those people doing the research, they don't know what value it. Nobody ever calls them on the phone or write. Most people who write articles are thrilled if you even send them an email like, oh my God, somebody read that and is coming back to me.
The bigger implications, I guess, are for educational pedagogy, if that's the word. You know, the Greeks did their lecturing walking around the tasks, around the track. And if you fell asleep, you fell out, and it was kind of obvious. It was harder to fall asleep. And the Germans have a, what is it, Kinderwald, where the kids are out in the woods playing and learning all sorts of concepts, measuring things, building stuff, but they're all moving around.
Yes.
And it goes up until age 7. So those that are developmentally delayed have some time to catch up in their, you know, the brain progression to myelination to move forward before they're made to sit in rows and start learning to write cursive or print or whatever.
Well, that form of education came out of the British bureaucracy. Those are the people. The Prussians were doing it, and then the British said, "Well, we can do that too," because it was all about training the military people. And then but the British started training people at earlier and earlier ages. Prussia fell out, and then Germany got more powerful. But England was ahead in the Industrial Revolution by a long shot. That's why we were choking everybody to death in London with coal, and which brought up lead poisoning for a lot of the population and alcoholism. But the Germans started following suit. And so this whole thing of starting kids, and they kept doing it younger and younger in the United States. The reason it started in the United States, it was written for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was the first ones to start regular schooling, and it was called the Devil's Playground Clause. Idle hands of the Devil's Playground, and so they named the clause that literally. And their purpose, they got together. It was a bunch of industrialists at the textile mills, because in that area of Massachusetts, the textile mills were making huge amounts of money. It was a major economic force in the colonies, in New England in particular. So they all got together for some meetings and decided it would be best to take all these people who were farm kids and stuff and to get them into school, because they needed more and well-trained people. They couldn't train these farm kids as they were. So they started putting them into school and training them, and then moving into the textile mills to work. And back then, you know, kids, 10, 11, 12 were working in the textile mills. So they were making good money, cheap pay, and the kids were getting trained. So that's literally where the American school system came from. You can look it up. I had to do research on it in graduate school for organizational analysis. I was just amazed to read that. So, everybody just takes for granted what we have, and then, after 2 generations, it becomes, well, this is the way it's done. And on average, if you look at the literature, they did experiments where they found that effect goes on for 7 generations unless something stops it, and can go farther. So the biblical thing of 7 generations is ironically been supported by research. And it's, human behavior is that way. It's the same thing with John Hopkins in the late 1890s said, well, all medical students should be trained this way, and they don't really need sleep, and they should go for 2 or 3 days with almost sleep is fine. But they found out the guy who implemented that was a cocaine addict, and that's how he was doing it. And he died young from heart problems due to the cocaine. It's interesting how we just accept things. So now we have kids get up in high school. They have to get up at 5 or 6 in the morning to get their bus or to get to school by 7 or 8. And that violates all the modern research we know about teenagers. They shouldn't be getting up that early in the morning. It undermines their academic performance, but that's the way we've always done it. We're going to keep doing it. It's the same way in science and the science department. That's why Thomas Kuhn wrote that famous book, The Nature of Scientific Revolutions. And he said, well, you know, we basically move forward when when the old guard dies out, you know, one funeral at a time, we slowly move forward with innovation. So I think those things are important to take into account in your mindset when you're working with people clinically. If you know, not only know what's going on, but why it came to be that way, you have a better understanding when you explain it to your clients. Oh, well, this isn't really necessary. Your kids are getting up early. They don't have to. You might want to go to the PTA and raise this point at some time, because in Jersey they did this and they got massive improvements in school performance.
There was another New Jersey township that listened to the parents and banned homework because they wanted to enjoy their children before they left them.
And by the way, there is no homework in some of the Scandinavian schools at all. They did the research. They said, this doesn't work. So this whole thing of loading kids up with homework at night, it's the worst thing you can do. It stresses them out, doesn't give their brain a chance to process information work, gets them too ramped up for sleep, it makes them upset. It's homework, as much as we're all wedded to the idea, doesn't improve academic performance. And there's a lot of research to show that. And you can go look it up. It's out there. It's good research too. So yeah, good points, Michael. You know, when I'm working with kids with attention deficits, I just want to pull my hair out with the parents I'm dealing with. It's one of the reasons I got burned out, but it's because dealing with the parents, they just didn't understand the stuff. And when you try to explain it, they said, well, we don't really believe that, you know. And I'm like, well, you're paying me to tell you I'm an expert in this area. I got degrees for it, and I can show you the research. But if you don't want to follow it, then I can only help your kid so much. And they're thinking, well, he must be wrong. Let's go find somebody else to get him some drugs or something else. Go down to the brain balance clinic. It's like, okay. Okay, well, we're past the hour. I don't know how I got talking so much, but that seems to be the trend. But thank you, everybody. Michael, Judy,
Brian,
Brian,
for bringing it up.
Brian, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. We really love it when people bring stuff up. And who was it earlier who brought in the questions?
Bobby.
Bobby, yeah, Bobby, thanks a lot.
Yeah. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Be safe. See you Monday night.